January 12, 1945. Rhineland Palatinate, Western Germany. ****. The wind cut through the valley like a blade forged in the Arctic. Snow had fallen for 3 days straight, blanketing the rubble of what had once been a market square in the town of Prum. The cobblestones, cracked and scorched from months of shelling, lay hidden beneath a white shroud. In the skeletal remains of a bombed-out church, a group of women huddled together, their breath forming pale clouds in the frozen air. Their coats, thin, patched, stitched together from curtains and old blankets, offered little more than dignity. Beneath those makeshift layers, their bodies had grown hollow. Rations had dwindled to nothing. The men were gone, dead, missing, or captured. The children cried less now. Not because they had learned patience, but because hunger had taught them silence. Then, from the western road, came the rumble of engines. At first, the sound triggered fear. 4 years, that sound had meant destruction. Luftwaffe bombers, Panzertreads, the mechanized fist of a war machine that had dragged the world into hell. But this time, the engines did not scream. They growled, low and steady, like the breath of something vast and unbothered by the cold. The women peered through shattered windows and cracked doorways. What they saw made no sense. Trucks! American trucks! Dozens of them, painted olive drab, rolling through the snow as if the war had already ended. And on the back of those trucks, stacked higher than a man could reach, were bundles wrapped in canvas and oilcloth. The convoy slowed. Then stopped. Soldiers jumped down, their boots crunching in the snow, their uniforms thick and insulated, their faces pink with warmth. They began unloading the bundles, tossing them into piles in the square as if they were sandbags, as if they were nothing. One of the women, her name was Margaret, though history would not remember her, stepped forward. Her feet were wrapped in rags. Her hands, red and cracked, trembled as she approached the nearest pile. An American soldier, no older than 20, saw her and smiled. He said something in English. She did not understand. But he gestured toward the bundles, nodding, as if to say, "Go ahead." She knelt in the snow. Her fingers, stiff with cold, pulled at the canvas. It fell away. Beneath it, folded with military precision, was a coat. Not a coat like the ones she had known, threadbare, lice-ridden, smelling of sweat and smoke. This coat was thick, heavy, lined with wool so soft it felt like something from a dream. The outer shell was a deep olive green, stitched with double seams, reinforced at the shoulders and elbows. There were buttons, real buttons, not wooden toggles or strips of cloth. There were pockets, deep and functional, with flaps that buttoned down. There was a hood, tucked into the collar, waiting to be pulled up against the wind. Margaret lifted the coat. It was so heavy she almost dropped it. She stared at it, her eyes wide, her lips parted. Then she turned to the other women, who had begun to gather around the piles, and she whispered the words that would echo through that frozen square, through the memory of those who survived, through the unwritten footnotes of a war that was ending but had not yet released its grip. Are these for us? To understand the weight of that question, one must first understand the Germany from which it emerged. By January 1945, the Third Reich was a corpse that refused to lie down. The 1,000-year Reich, which had promised glory and dominance, had lasted 12 years and was now collapsing under the weight of its own ambition. The Eastern Front had shattered. The Red Army, fueled by rage and vengeance, was closing in from the east, burning and grinding everything in its path. In the west, American and British forces had crossed the Rhine, and the vaunted Wehrmacht, once the most feared military machine on earth, was now a patchwork of old men, boys, and the last remnants of a generation that had been fed into the meat grinder of total war. But the collapse of the Reich was not merely military. It was existential. The German people, who had been told for years that they were the master race, that they were destined to rule Europe, that they were invincible, now found themselves living in a nightmare of their own making. Cities lay in ruins. Dresden, Hamburg, Cologne, once vibrant centers of culture and industry, had been reduced to ash and rubble by Allied bombing campaigns. Food was scarce. Fuel was scarce. Hope was scarce. The propaganda machine, which had once roared with the voice of Goebbels, now sputtered and wheezed, trying to convince a starving population that victory was still possible, that the Wunderwaffen, the miracle weapons, would turn the tide. No one believed it any more. For the women of Germany, the war had become a war of survival. The men were gone. The state, which had demanded their loyalty and their sons, had nothing left to give. Ration cards were worthless. The black market thrived, but it required currency or goods to trade, and most had neither. Women learned to boil grass and tree bark to make soup. They learned to trade family heirlooms for a loaf of bread. They learned to recognize the sound of different artillery shells by ear, to know which cellars offered the best shelter, to move through a bombed city as if it were a forest, navigating by instinct and memory. And they learned to fear the end. Because the end was coming, and no one knew what it would bring. Would the Americans and British be merciful? Would they take revenge for the horrors of the Nazi regime, for the concentration camps, for the conquered nations, for the millions of dead? Or would they simply walk away and let the Russians have their turn? The rumors were worse than the bombs. Stories filtered back from the East, stories of what the Red Army did to German women, to German towns. Stories that made the cold wind feel warm by comparison. And then the Americans arrived. The soldiers of the United States Army who rolled into Western Germany in the winter of 1945 were not conquerors in the classical sense. They were the sons of farmers, factory workers, shopkeepers, and teachers. They came from towns with names like Des Moines, Akron, Chattanooga, and San Diego. Most of them had never left the United States before being drafted. Most of them had never imagined they would find themselves standing in the snow in a country they had been taught to fear and hate. But they came prepared. The logistical apparatus of the United States military in World War II was one of the most staggering achievements in human history. It was not glamorous. It did not win medals or make headlines. But it was the engine that powered everything else. While German soldiers on the Eastern Front were freezing to death in summer uniforms because the supply lines had collapsed, American GIs were eating hot meals delivered to the front. While German civilians were burning furniture to stay warm, American supply depots were stocked with enough fuel, food, and material to wage war on 3 continents simultaneously. The winter coats that arrived in Prum that day in January were part of that system. They were M1943 field jackets, designed by the U.S. Army Quartermaster Corps after the disasters of the North African and Italian campaigns, where soldiers had suffered from inadequate cold weather gear. The M1943 was a marvel of practical design. It was windproof, water-resistant, insulated with wool, and built to last. It had been tested in the snows of Alaska and the mountains of northern Italy. It had been mass-produced in factories across the United States, stitched together by women who worked 12-hour shifts in plants that ran day and night. And now, in the ruins of a German town, those coats were being handed out like candy. The soldiers did not do this out of charity alone. There were orders, of course. The Allied command had determined that stabilizing the civilian population was a strategic necessity. A starving, desperate population was a breeding ground for disease, for partisan resistance, for chaos that could disrupt supply lines and slow the advance. The coats, the food, the medical supplies, they were tools of war, just as much as bullets and tanks. But that does not mean the soldiers themselves were indifferent. Private First Class Eugene Hartman, a clerk from Ohio, would later write in a letter home, "I don't know what I expected when we got here. I guess I thought they'd all be Nazis, you know? Like in the movies. But they're just people. Just women and kids, mostly. They look at us like we're ghosts. Like they can't believe we're real. One lady cried when I gave her a coat. Just stood there in the snow and cried. I didn't know what to say. So I just nodded and moved on. Asterisk. Another soldier, Corporal James Lee, a mechanic from Georgia, recorded in his diary, Asterisk, these people have nothing. I mean nothing. We complain about K-rations, but at least we got them. These folks are eating things I wouldn't feed to a dog. And the kids, Jesus, the kids are so thin you can see their bones. We handed out chocolate bars today. Some of the kids didn't even know what chocolate was. How do you win a war against people like that? I don't know. I just don't know. Asterisk. The coats became symbols. Not just of American material superiority, though they were certainly that, but of something deeper, something ideological, something that would shape the Cold War before the Cold War even had a name. Margaret pulled the coat over her shoulders. It hung heavy, almost too heavy, as if the weight of it might pull her down into the snow. But it was warm. So warm. She could feel the heat trapped inside the wool lining, could feel it seeping into her skin, into her bones, into places that had been cold for so long she had forgotten what warmth felt like. Around her, the other women were doing the same, pulling on coats that were too big, too clean, too new. Some of them wept. Some of them laughed. Some of them simply stood in silence, staring at their own hands, at the sleeves that covered their wrists, at the buttons that actually fastened. An older woman, her name was Hilda, approached one of the American soldiers. She spoke no English, but she tried anyway, her voice cracking, her hands gesturing. The soldier did not understand, but he smiled and nodded. He pulled a pack of cigarettes from his pocket and handed it to her. She stared at it as if he had handed her a bar of gold. Then she clutched it to her chest and walked away, her eyes streaming. This was not what they had been told. For years, the Nazi propaganda machine had painted a picture of the Americans. They were soft, decadent, weak, a nation of mongrels and Jews and capitalists who cared only for money, who had no culture, no discipline, no warrior spirit. When the invasion came, the propaganda promised, the Americans would crumble. They would run. They would beg for mercy. But here they were, standing in the snow, handing out coats. The women of Prum had expected cruelty. They had expected revenge. They had expected to be treated as the enemy, as the wives and mothers of the men who had invaded Poland, France, Russia, who had built the camps, who had started the war. And perhaps they deserved that. Perhaps, in the cold arithmetic of justice, they deserved to freeze. But the Americans did not see it that way. Or perhaps they did, and chose differently. The coat became a recurring image in the testimonies of those who survived the final months of the war. In archives across Germany, in oral histories collected by universities and museums, in letters and diaries that have been digitized and preserved, the coat appears again and again. Sometimes it is described in practical terms, its warmth, its durability, its pockets. Sometimes it is described in emotional terms, its softness, its cleanliness, its foreignness. And sometimes it is described in symbolic terms, as a kind of proof. Proof that the propaganda had been a lie. Proof that the enemy was not what they had been told. Proof that somewhere, beyond the borders of the Reich, there was a world that still functioned, that still produced, that still cared. One woman, interviewed in 1987 for a German television documentary, remembered, I thought the coat was a trick at first. I thought they would give it to us and then take it back, or demand something in return. But they didn't. They just gave it to us. And I thought, if they can make coats like this, if they can give them away, then how rich must they be? How powerful? And if they are that powerful, and they choose to give us coats instead of shooting us, then maybe, we were wrong about everything. Asterisk. Another woman, writing in her diary in March 1945, noted, asterisk, the coat smells like America. I don't know how else to describe it. It smells clean. Like soap and something else, something I can't name. It doesn't smell like smoke or sweat or death. It smells like a place where people are not afraid. Asterisk. This was the power of material abundance. Not just the abundance itself, but what it represented. The United States, by 1945, was producing nearly half of the world's industrial output. Its factories, untouched by bombing, ran around the clock. Its workers, many of them women who had taken jobs in the war industries, churned out planes, tanks, ships, guns, uniforms, food, medicine, and yes, coats, at a rate that defied comprehension. The Soviet Union, by comparison, was bleeding itself white to hold the line. Britain was bankrupt, surviving on American loans. Germany and Japan were burning their furniture to stay alive. And the Americans? The Americans had so much they could afford to give it away. This was the ideological weapon that no bomb could match. The coat was not just a coat. It was a message. It said, asterisk, we are not like you. We do not scorch the earth. We do not starve our enemies. We build. We produce. We give. And we do it not because we are weak, but because we are strong. Strong enough to be generous. Strong enough to show mercy. Asterisk. But generosity, in war, is never simple. The decision to provide aid to the German civilian population was controversial within the Allied command. There were those who argued that the Germans deserved to suffer, that they had brought this upon themselves, that every ounce of aid given to a German woman was an ounce taken from an Allied soldier or a liberated prisoner. General George S. Patton, never one to mince words, reportedly said, asterisk, let them starve. They've been starving everyone else for 5 years. Let them see how it feels. Asterisk. But others saw it differently. General Dwight D. Eisenhower, the supreme commander of the Allied forces in Europe, understood that the war would not end with Germany's military defeat. It would end with Germany's reconstruction. And reconstruction required a stable population, not a starving mob. He issued orders that civilian relief efforts were to be prioritized, that food, medicine, and clothing were to be distributed, that the German people were to be treated humanely, not out of sentimentality, but out of strategic necessity. The soldiers on the ground, for the most part, followed those orders. Not because they loved the Germans, not because they had forgiven them, but because they were Americans, and Americans, for all their flaws, had been raised in a culture that valued pragmatism over vengeance, that believed in second chances, that saw itself as a nation of builders rather than destroyers. This was the contradiction at the heart of the American project. The United States had built its prosperity on stolen land and enslaved labor. It had internment camps for Japanese Americans and segregation for black soldiers. It was not innocent. It was not pure. But it was, in that moment, the best option available. And the women of Prum, standing in the snow with American coats on their shoulders, understood that. They understood that the world was not divided into the good and the evil, but into the survivable and the unsurvivable. And the Americans, for all their flaws, were survivable. The war ended 4 months later. On May 8, 1945, Germany surrendered unconditionally. The Reich that was supposed to last 1,000 years had lasted 12. The cities were ruins. The economy was shattered. The population was traumatized, guilty, and lost. But they were alive. And many of them, especially in the western zones occupied by the Americans, British, and French, were alive because of the coats, the food, the medicine, the infrastructure that the Allies brought with them. The coat, in many ways, became a symbol of the Marshall Plan before the Marshall Plan even existed. It was a preview of the philosophy that would guide American policy in Europe for the next half-century. That prosperity was the best defense against extremism, that rebuilding was cheaper than occupation, that generosity, even to former enemies, was not weakness, but strategy. But for the women who received those coats, it was not about strategy. It was about survival, and about the slow, painful realization that the world they had believed in, the world they had been told was glorious and eternal, had been a lie. The Reich had promised them greatness and had delivered only ashes. The Americans, whom they had been taught to despise, had delivered warmth. Margaret wore her coat for years after the war. She wore it through the occupation, through the airlift, through the division of Germany and the rise of the Iron Curtain. She wore it as she rebuilt her life in the ruins of Prum, as she remarried and raised a new family, as she watched her children grow up in a country that was no longer the Third Reich, but the Federal Republic of Germany, a democracy built on the ashes of dictatorship. She wore it until it fell apart at the seams, until the wool lining was worn through, until the buttons had been replaced a dozen times and the fabric was more patched than original cloth. And when it finally could not be repaired any longer, she did not throw it away. She folded it carefully and placed it in a trunk in her attic, where it remained for the rest of her life. When she died, in 1983, her daughter found the coat. She did not understand why her mother had kept it. It was old, worn, useless. She almost threw it away. But something stopped her. Maybe it was the careful way it had been folded. Maybe it was the faint smell that still clung to it, that clean, foreign smell that her mother had once described as the smell of America. Maybe it was the knowledge, passed down in fragments of stories, that this coat had once meant something, that it had once been the difference between freezing and surviving. She kept the coat. And when the Berlin Wall fell in 1989, she wore it to the celebration in the streets. She wore it not because it fit, it was far too big, but because it felt right. Because it was a reminder that the world could change, that enemies could become allies, that the machines of war could be turned into the tools of peace. In the end, the coat was just a coat. It was wool and thread and buttons, mass-produced in a factory in Ohio or Pennsylvania, shipped across the Atlantic in the hold of a Liberty ship, unloaded in Antwerp or Le Havre, trucked to a depot, and distributed to soldiers who handed it to civilians in a ruined town on a cold day in January. But it was also more than a coat. It was a symbol of abundance in a land of scarcity. It was a symbol of mercy in a time of cruelty. It was a symbol of a different kind of power, not the power to destroy, but the power to create, to provide, to rebuild. It was a symbol of the choices that nations make, and the legacies those choices leave behind. The women of Prum, standing in the snow, did not know that they were witnessing the beginning of the Cold War, the birth of the post-war order, the first stirrings of what would become the European Union. They did not know that their children would grow up in a Germany that was prosperous and democratic, that was integrated into the West, that would become one of the most stable and successful nations on earth. All they knew was that they were cold, and someone had given them a coat. And sometimes that is enough. Sometimes the small acts of humanity, the coats and the chocolate bars and the nods and the smiles, are the things that change the world. Not because they are grand or heroic, but because they are human. Because they remind us, in the midst of the horror and the chaos and the grinding machinery of war, that we are capable of more than destruction. That we are capable of kindness. That we are capable, even in the darkest moments, of choosing to give rather than take, to build rather than burn, to warm rather than freeze. The coat is a reminder that the war was not just a battle between armies and ideologies, but a battle between two visions of humanity. One vision saw the world as a place of scarcity, where only the strong survived, where mercy was weakness and compassion was folly. The other vision saw the world as a place of abundance, where strength was measured not by how much you could take, but by how much you could give. The women of Prum, with American coats on their shoulders, chose the second vision. Not because they were saints or heroes, but because they were human, and because, in the end, that was the only choice that mattered. The wind still blows cold through the valleys of the Rhineland. The snow still falls in January. But somewhere, in the attics and trunks and closets of families across Germany, there are still coats. Old coats, worn coats, coats that have been patched and repaired and handed down through generations. Coats that smell, faintly, of a place where people are not afraid. And that, perhaps, is the greatest victory of all.